Unless you're involved in the disability justice movement, it's possible, maybe even probable, that you have never heard of H.R. 620, the ADA Education and Reform Act of 2017. The idea of pushing a bill that attacked the Americans with Disabilities Act was not new, having most recently been introduced in 2015, but as you've probably noticed, times have changed. And past attempts that didn't get much traction, guess what? In 2018, H.R. 620 got enough steam to attract 108 co-sponsors, including Missouri's own Jason Smith, the 8th District in the Southeast, Blaine Luetkemeyer, the 3rd District, which includes Jeff City and St. Louis, and of course, the name you were probably expecting, Billy Long, 7th District, from right here in Southwest Missouri. As Sarah Novich with NBC News summed it up, on February 15th, while the country had its eye on allegations of Russian election meddling and the senseless murder of 17 people in the Parkland school shooting, the House was quietly gutting the Americans with Disabilities Act, passing H.R. 620 with a vote of 225 to 192. That bill was received in the Senate on February 26th, and it's still there waiting. Whenever I encounter something like this, whether it's a piece of legislation or a bad joke, I ask myself, who is gaining what? What does this have to do with how society is constructed? And what does it have to do with who has the power? What does this say about our values and aspirations as a society? Because since 1990, the ADA has given at least some legal leverage to people with disabilities to pursue access to public accommodations. While far from perfect, as anyone navigating inaccessibility in the U.S. can tell you, the ADA has played an important role in getting Americans used to the idea that society should be accessible to everyone. But H.R. 620 reduces that leverage. Instead of, in the old process, simply filing a lawsuit to get your accessibility, now if H.R. 620 becomes law, you would first make a written complaint to the business owner who violated the ADA. The owner then has 60 days to acknowledge your complaint, followed by 120 days to take action. During that time, the bill would only require substantial progress be made. And that's a hollow, subjective phrase if I've ever heard one, and it will almost be certainly used to postpone compliance. After all, how do you measure substantial progress? Only then, after 6 months, could a suit be filed. In other words, H.R. 620 introduces a waiting period for folks to pursue their civil rights. I don't know about you, but I got a little tired just reading that list. How many people do you think will simply give up on justice because there's simply not enough time, energy, and resources to do all this extra work? And are we providing accessible copies of the ADA to all people labeled with disabilities in their language so that they can educate violators? Because this is one of the core criticisms of H.R. 620. It shifts the burden onto people who are already being discriminated against. Here's the justification for the bill. One, it prevents money awards, even though monetary awards are not allowed under Title III of the ADA, and monetary awards are only available under certain state laws, which wouldn't be changed by H.R. 620. You can only get payment for the legal services that you had, and damages, that kind of thing. Two, it limits so-called frivolous lawsuits, even though courts already have the power to deal with serial litigation and fraudulent claims. And three, they say it will help businesses understand ADA standards, even though they have had 28 years to learn, and even though it puts the burden on the victims to educate their oppressors on how to behave with human decency. The basic gain here is for businesses that view ADA compliance as a financial liability and are looking for loopholes. Because all of this, it really should be basic stuff, shouldn't it? No one should have a difficult time understanding, for example, that an accessible bathroom stall should be big enough to maneuver a wheelchair, that emergency rooms and police stations should have access to sign language interpreters, that elevators should be equipped to beep or speak at each floor. As a society, we should be actively doing more, not conniving to do less. If we're on the side of justice, H.R. 620 invites us to be honest about the failure of our society to take seriously the experience of discrimination on the basis of disability. When we place the burden of compliance on the victims of injustice, what does that say about us? It says we are not listening, because if we were, we would know that there is an enormous amount of suffering and oppression that goes on every day, experienced by millions of people in the United States who cannot access places, services, resources, people. And it says that we do not care, because these conditions exist simply because we have refused to act, because our society has valued profit over people and evaluates people's worth according to their financial productivity. To put it plainly, we have made a society where it's more important for a business to make a profit than for us to value and care for one another. We have more than enough resources. We have just not had the will. I use the word disability a little begrudgingly because I think the way it's commonly used shifts the emphasis away from society and onto an individual, and shifts our attention away from aspirations such as common humanity and onto an imaginary, rugged individualism, away from justice and onto profit. It's also a confusing word because its meaning changes according to time, culture, and circumstance. For example, A.J. Withers, writing in Disability Politics and Theory, examined 6 main models, and that would be enough, but listed 21 additional models that have been used to discuss, pathologize, and legislate disability. To complicate matters, most of us haven't spent a great time examining our own thoughts and assumptions about disability, making it more likely that we'll simply accept the rampant disableism all around us. At a personal reflection, I think all of us could stand to spend more time unpacking our own assumptions and attitudes about disability, because we can't effectively resist unjust systems that we do not understand. As we do, we'll do well to remember that humans are social organisms. At almost every moment of our lives, we are depending on and trusting other human beings to survive. As Withers pointed out, what is considered normal or non-disabled is constructed around certain kinds of people while leaving others out. No one is actually independent. This is a myth perpetuated by disableism and driven by capitalism. We are all actually interdependent. Chances are, disabled or not, you don't grow all of your food. Chances are you didn't build the car, bike, wheelchair, subway, shoes, or bus that transports you. Chances are you didn't construct your home. Chances are you didn't sew your clothing or make the fabric and thread used to sew it. Withers' point here is really essential if we want to understand how disableism works, both in our wider society and within our own minds. Disableism shares this in common with other oppressive systems. It insists on defining what is normal and then uses that definition to elicit either pity or disgust for anyone who doesn't neatly fit. It's a powerful tool to dehumanize people. And dehumanized people, guess what? They're easier to ignore or exploit. This is what oppressive systems do to marginalized groups on the basis of things like skin color, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, age, ability, class. If you think someone is bad in some way, it's easier to overlook or even justify abusing them. If you think someone is pitiable, it's easier to dismiss their value as a human being and with them, their criticisms of unjust systems. Disableism, then, is a justice issue, and it intersects with other forms of oppression, since most people facing discrimination belong to more than one marginalized group. As examples, consider this. Approximately 26% of non-institutionalized persons with a disability in the United States in 2016 were also living below the poverty line. 3 in 10 Native people and 1 in 4 Black people in the United States have a disability. Statistics have revealed that there are higher rates of disability among lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults. And in what is no surprise for most of us in the transgender and non-binary community, a 2016 study found that participants who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder were also 7.76 times more likely to report gender variance than the control sample. My own neurodivergence aside, there are still plenty of people who understand diverse gender identities and sexualities themselves as evidence of a mental disability and would seek to pathologize and exclude us on that basis. In each of those cases and more, disability is used to further dehumanize us with the tyranny of the so-called normal. Whenever this dynamic is at work, it's important for us to understand how these labels are being used to control people and accumulate power. In the United States, at least, normal will come as no surprise to you. Normal is considered white, male, straight, cisgender, well-educated, financially stable, young, and healthy. The more of those boxes you check off, the more likely you are to have access to and control of money and power. Disabled folk living beyond society's expectations may make great stories to be consumed for inspiration, stories that can be packaged and sold. But disabled folk who are demanding equality and accessibility threaten those who insist on a socioeconomic system that disregards the well-being of all its people, that prefers profit over justice. Those who insist on being heard are demonized and dismissed. And we saw just recently as 17 activists were arrested for chanting for their civil rights in the House chambers, while our legislators still went on to pass H.R. 620. Our apathy towards this kind of dehumanization and injustice relies on us not noticing or caring that we are being manipulated against our personal and collective well-being. Returning to A.J. Withers, they wrote, "The difference between the needs that many disabled people have and the needs of people who are not labeled as disabled is that non-disabled people have had their dependencies normalized. The world has been built to accommodate certain needs and call the people who need those things independent, while other needs are considered exceptional. Each of us relies on others every day. We all rely on one another for support, resources, and to meet our needs. This interdependence is not weakness. Rather, it is part of our humanity." Withers' insight points us to two closely related pathways. First, we have got to do more to normalize accessibility, especially in a climate where things like the ADA is being attacked. In both public and private, we can ask ourselves, what does this space assume about its users? Who's included? Who's left out? I know we cannot anticipate every need because human beings are incredibly diverse, but we can take steps to communicate that we value every person and want to include one another. For example, a friend of mine pointed out that even though fewer blind people are using Braille today, posting Braille signage does not only benefit those who read Braille. It also tells everyone in that space that this is a community that includes blind people. We can be creative about how we communicate these kinds of values. We can do things like host ASL classes. We can set aside sensory soothing spaces. Normalizing accessibility makes us more aware of each other's needs and more inclined to support each other because it's become normal that we need to go out of our way to do things to include one another. Second, and closely related, we need to normalize interdependence. We are culturally trained to understand interdependence as a weakness, and people who need accommodations are often perceived as weak, even as a burden. People refuse to help one another for fear of taking on too much, and the people who do support each other are seen as something to admire, the wonderful exceptions. We've got this backwards. Supporting one another should be what is normal, not a burden and not an inconvenience. We all need other humans, and cooperation works for our species. Especially if you are not labeled with a disability, consider in any given moment how much must be going right now. How many humans had to work together to make this moment come to be? Think about how many humans you depended on just to get to this gathering service this morning. Shelter, food, clothing, transportation, energy, technology, pharmaceuticals, and a host of other things. Then think about what it would be like if the people and the things that you depend on were labeled suddenly as exceptional. A good friend calls people who aren't labeled or don't identify as disabled tabs, temporarily able-bodied. That reframing can be useful in retraining our awareness, but we can go even further. Disability is not about bodies as much as it is about our society, about those we collectively choose to exclude. Disability is a social construct to our shame, but interdependence is an essential and wonderful part of our humanity. As we normalize accessibility and interdependence, we'll also find ourselves changing in other ways. We'll be listening and learning when someone has a need we do not yet understand, rather than dismissing them outright or justifying our unwillingness to adapt. We'll be rooting out the internalized oppression and dominance within us, including the assumptions and perceptions we have about disabilities, a process I will be talking more about next week. We'll be advocating alongside folk who are opposing legislation like HR 620, and we'll be supporting organizations and activists with our time, energy, and money. We'll become more aware of and grateful for the humans and technologies we depend upon every day in our lives, and more welcoming and supportive of one another. It's not easy, especially in a society that can manage to do things like send HR 620 to the Senate. Our society has set things up to be difficult, but it is worthy of our common humanity, and it is a source of justice, peace, and joy. So with that interdependence in mind, I'd like us to finish this morning by reading again the prayer of confession, maybe this time more as a prayer of affirmation, to acknowledge and celebrate our ongoing commitment to live in a way that doesn't stand idly by, but embraces change in the path of justice. So let's read together. In a society where everything is measured in dollars, it's not surprising that people are reduced to profits, our worth tethered to our ability and productivity. So we grieve together at how easy it becomes to go along with these lies and let them take root inside and around us. We desire and commit to value ourselves and others according to the standards of human dignity, according to a vision of mutuality and equity, according to the wisdom of interdependence and love. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.